Welcome to this first module of the academic writing course brought to you by Deutscher Hochschulverband. I'm Professor Dirk Siepmann from Osnabrück University. Let's see what's in store for you in this first module, which is about word combining. So we're going to look at how to combine one word with another, which is the basic question that is constantly at the forefront of our minds when we write a text. And there are two different models I'd like to introduce you to. One is an older one, which I call the old model here, and one is a new model, which is, to my mind at least, more appropriate. And I'm going to argue in favor of this new model. I'm then going to illustrate this new model with a few examples and a kind of typology of word combinations. And I'm going to suggest a few strategies that you can use in your own writing to locate word combinations on the web, in dictionaries, and so on. Now, this is the old model I've just been alluding to. It basically says that there are fixed sentence structures in English and in any other language for that matter. But let's focus on English first. Sentence structures like a subject followed by a verb, followed by an object, and so on. And the subject and object slots, for example, can be filled with nouns, and the verb slot can be filled with verbs. So the idea we get from this kind of portrayal of the language is that we can be infinitely creative in our language use. We can create any number of sentences based on this simple pattern. Is this true? Not quite. The result is what I call the creative fallacy. Kreativer Irrtum in German. We'd get sentences like ships sail or houses stand, which we never find in real life, in the actual use of language. Where we do find these sentences occasionally is in grammars, and they're basically used by grammarians to make the point that these sentence structures exist. So they have to find some kind of example, which they usually make up on the basis of their linguistic intuition. But actual usage or consultation of what we call corpora, large collections of language, tend to show that sentences like this are actually quite rare. And the ones I'm illustrating here cannot be located anywhere. What we do find is sentences like the ship sailed into bay and dropped anchor. Now, what's the difference between the above sentences and this one? Well, we still have the fixed word element, the lexical element, sail. So that's the only fixed element in our equation. And as we can see, we get some variation in the subject slot, where we can have any kind of ship. So this could also be a pleasure boat, it could be an ocean liner. And what we also require is an adverb of place. So sail needs to be followed by an adverb of place. This could be into a bay, it could also be into the harbor or into the port or across the ocean or whatever. But we do need this adverb of place. So apparently what native speakers memorize, what they have in their minds, is not a sentence structure that we fill with word material, but rather a prefabricated construction that consists of different types of elements. And this is the idea that I'm going to develop in the rest of this talk. Now let's first look at an ordinary piece of text. Just at the first sentence, conventional wisdom in the 30-something era declares that the American marriage is in serious trouble. Now, If we look at the beginning of the sentence from a German perspective, or for that matter, from the perspective of any other language, we'll probably find that it sounds rather creative, and you might think that what I've just been saying is actually wrong. Since we have conventional wisdom, so wisdom is conventionalized. We could also have orthodox wisdom, perhaps, and this wisdom says something. It's followed by a verb of saying. So wisdom is, in a way, personalized, personified, which is a bit weird from the perspective of other languages. That is. Well, let's have a look at whether this is actually something very creative that the journalist came up with. And what we find is that if we look at a lot of examples or a lot of text at once, we find that this particular phrase actually occurs quite a few times in journalistic language, in newspaper language. Interestingly, we find that it's not just, well, in this case, we can only see conventional wisdom, but there are other variants for the adjective slot, we might say, for the adjectival attribute, orthodox wisdom, for instance, or received wisdom. But more interestingly, perhaps, if we look at the right-hand context, we find that there are all sorts of verbs of saying, so that this kind of phrase seems to be followed quite commonly by a verb of saying. We have conventional wisdom suggests, conventional wisdom says, which is the most basic verb of saying, of course. Conventional wisdom holds. Holds is just a synonym of say here, of maintain. In German, that will be behaupten. And then there's the phrase have it that, which also occurs in phrases like as Shakespeare has it, wie schon Shakespeare sagte. And as we can see from the translation I've just given, this also has the general meaning of say. So apparently, the phrase is not at all creative. It's a phrase that other writers have used before, and all the journalist is doing here is repeating the same phrase or varying it slightly by using the verb of saying declare rather than say or suggest. So what we've just established is that this first sentence, conventional wisdom in the 30-something era declares that, is actually not creative at all, although it looks creative at first blush, at first sight. Now we could do the same thing for the entire text, and what we would find is that anything I've marked in yellow here is actually non-creative. It's not creative language use, it's language that's being reused, language that has been used before, prefabricated language, in other words. So the only things that remain are proper nouns like Psychology Today, Gallup, or King World's Inside Edition, and so on. And the rest of the text is non-creative. And this actually applies to any kind of text. So we look at this in statistical terms, we find that around 80% of all text consists of specific word-based constructions, and these are sometimes called collocations. I'm not going to use a lot of terminology, but this is a basic term that you might want to remember. Collocation, so a word-based construction consisting, as we'll see, either of two words or more words, and these words team up with each other quite frequently. So constructions are everywhere, they're ubiquitous, they're pervasive, and any text is usually entirely composed of prefabricated constructions, unless we're talking about poetry. for example. So once we've understood this notion of construction, the next question to ask is, of course, what sort of constructions are there? And what I'm proposing here is a three-part division of the spectrum of constructions. The first type being what I've just called a collocation, a lexical construction, that is, a construction consisting of two or more words. And the basic type here, of course, is the two-word collocation. Let's take the common academic noun assumption as an example. Assumption combines with adjectives like basic, fundamental, hidden. So a typical collocation of a noun is with an adjective, that's obvious. Another typical collocation is with quantifiers. So you get sentences like, your argument is based on a set of questionable assumptions. In German, this would be eine Reihe von Annahmen. And then we have verbal collocations, of course, with verbs like with nouns like assumption. And there are two types. One where assumption is the object of the verb, so it follows the verb. We get things like she's always making assumptions about something, or you work on an assumption. And those collocations where assumption precedes the verb. So for instance, an assumption underlies something. In German that would be eine Annahme liegt etwas zugrunde. Now, one of the major problems with collocations is that they differ between languages. So German collocations are very often different from English ones. I've given a few simple examples here, such as pay a visit, which is one of those verb-noun collocations where visit is the object of pay. And in German, of course, we wouldn't use the basic translation of pay here, but we would say Besuch abstatten. The avalanche came down. In German, we tend to say die Lawine ging nieder rather than die Lawine kam nieder, which is a typical subject noun plus verb collocation. Wide powers, which corresponds to umfangreiche Kompetenzen, so neither the noun powers nor the adjective wide translate easily into German here. We have to use slightly different wordings in German. Adjective plus adverb combinations, sorely tempted, stark in Versuchung. Set of assumptions, noun plus of plus noun, also common type of collocation, but it's not eine Menge von Annahmen in German, rather eine Reihe von Annahmen. And we have adverbs plus prepositions. It should be adverb. Adverbs plus prepositions. It happened somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. Vor etwa, rather than irgendwo zwischen 100,000 und 200,000 Jahren. And one type of collocation that is extremely important in academic text, of course, is longer combinations, which you might call multi-word markers, because they mark specific relations, rhetorical relations in text. So for instance, you've just been talking about a problem and you want to mention another one. Typically in German, you'll use something like erschweren kommt hinzu das. And in English, this could be a further complication, is that. Or anders verhält es sich mit, you're introducing a contrast. In English, this might be the case, is different with. Now, these are difficult to locate in dictionaries, because if you look up something like erschweren kommt hinzu das in a dictionary, you would probably find to make matters worse, which is a good translation, but you can only use it in a colloquial context. For instance, well, to make matters worse, it started to rain, but I left my umbrella at home, or something like that. That's a typical context for to make matters worse. So dictionaries won't give you the academic phrases that need to be used to encode particular rhetorical relations. These multi-word markers, to complicate matters a bit, these multi-word markers enter into long-distance collocations. So they collocate with other markers across considerable distances. So you get something like turning to, which is used to initiate a topic change. You change from one topic to another, turning to the speech of older speakers. And then you want to say something you found out about the speech of older speakers, and you typically use a phrase like "we find that," or "we note that," or "we found that," "we noted that," or "it was found that," and so on, which in German corresponds to "wenn wir uns nun blah 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 zu." That's the topic change, and hier fällt auf das is giving evidence. So far we've been dealing with very simple combinations between words. For instance, assumption plus basic gives us the collocation basic assumption. There are more complex constructions which might be described as combinations of meaning components. We've already seen one. The conventional wisdom example, where we found that conventional wisdom is often combined with verbs of saying. So not with one specific verb, one specific word. It's not a two-word collocation, but rather a collocation between a phrase, conventional wisdom, and a particular meaning component, which is the meaning component say. Verbs of saying. Another example is provided by phrases like recent years or the past few decades have seen something. They've seen an upsurge of interest in nanotechnology, for instance. So underlying this is the general combination of meaning components, again, a time expression, recent years, plus a verb like see or witness, plus the event that these times have witnessed. Of course, in German, this kind of construction is again impossible. It's a kind of animistic construction where the subject is personified, and this is somewhat less frequent in German, I'd say, than in English. So the second type of construction we've been looking at here is a combination of meaning components. The third major type of construction is the combination of words and grammar. So for instance, if you look at the second example here, that's something you might have encountered before or might remember from your school days, where we have different plus from. So there's a word here, different. It's used with the preposition from, and then any kind of noun phrase. This could be different from the school, different from the system, different from the word, whatever, it doesn't matter. So the NP, the noun phrase, is a kind of placeholder here. And this is where this differs from the collocations we've just been looking at, because collocations are combinations of words, so fixed elements. And here we have a combination of a fixed element plus a totally free element, different from plus a noun. And it's quite similar with examples like there is an assumption of plus noun phrase, or assumption is also used with the that clause. There's an assumption that, and of course the that clause is a totally free element that can be filled with anything. Or a noun phrase is adjective in its assumption that. So we can say things like the theory is wrong in its assumption that, but we could also say the model is flawed in its assumption that, or the model is incorrect in its assumption that. So there's a certain amount of variation possible here, which we do not usually have with collocations. Another example, if you look at the third example, we have envy. That's a fairly everyday word, we might say. Envy someone something. Again, these constructions, importantly, differ from one language to another very often. So this is obvious with envy, where in German we say jemanden etwas beneiden. In English we say envy someone something. And then there are more general constructions like the adjective of the adjectiver, the more the better, the sooner the better, and so on. And of course, even more generally, or at an even more general level, we have passive voice, for instance. Almost any verb can be made passive. But we also have varying degrees of fixity. So some collocations are limited in, for instance, their ability to be pluralized. So we can say pass judgment on, but we can't say pass judgments about. Now let's turn to what goes wrong in the English of non-native writers or non-native speakers. Well, one basic thing that goes wrong is that fewer constructions are used more often. Of course, this is not as serious as actually committing an error, but it does often lead to rather monotonous texts. So, for instance, if you always use, for example, when you want to exemplify something, and you use it 20 times in your text, and if you always use another problem is that to express something like a second complication or a second problem, then this will lead to a lot of repetition. So fewer constructions used more often. The frequent use of the same constructions is not a correctness problem, if you like, but it may lead to stylistic monotony. A second type of problem is downright errors, and there are two types of word combining errors. The first can be traced back to overgeneralization in the second language, in this case English. So this is the case where you already have you already know two collocations, like carry out a task, carry out a project, which are two perfectly fine collocations in English, and so is perform a task. But what you can't say, or what you don't normally say, is perform a project, which might then be difficult to understand by native speakers, or also by the non-native speakers. They might think that this is about some kind of happening. A second type of error, and this is perhaps the most common type of error, is traceable to the influence of the first language. This is sometimes called negative transfer from the first language, or interference. And we often get that in cases where there's, where one part of the collocation can be literally translated, and that's usually called the base of the collocation or the node of the collocation. An example is make a photo, where photo is the same word in German basically, but the English collocation is take a photo. Or Germans tend to say things like I've made the experience that, but ich habe die Erfahrung gemacht, das in German, but in English we'd say something like my experience is that, or from my experience, or experience teaches that, or whatever, but certainly not make an experience, because make, as in the case of photo by the way, has the basic meaning of produce. So make a photo is not really impossible, but it would refer to the the actual production process, someone, well, in the old days, working in a dark room or something to actually produce a photo, but it's not about taking snapshots. So let's look at some of the strategies you can use to overcome problems with collocation. These are 5 in number. Collocations dictionaries. That is, you can use dictionaries that record these frequent word combinations. You can do Google searches. That's a second type of strategy. You can search corpora for particular word combinations. That is, you can look at very large collections of text, electronically held, machine-held collections of text available on the web. You can look at traditional learners' dictionaries, of course. And you can look at parallel texts. We'll see what that means in a minute. Now, this is what a typical entry from a collocational dictionary would look like. It's taken from Oxford Learner's Dictionary of Collocations, or Oxford Students' Dictionary of Collocation, with collocations, which is also available on the web at the address which you can see at the top of the page, ausdig.com. And what we can see here is the entry for the noun factor. And as we've already seen, a noun typically combines with an adjective, so you get typical adjectival collocations like an important factor, a major factor, a significant factor, a limiting factor, and so on. And you also get verbal collocations, where in this case factor is the object of the verb, so take factors into account, and so on. Another strategy you can use is Google searches. What you do is you type in the phrase that you're looking for, or the phrase that you want to check. You type it into the Google search box using inverted commas, so surrounding the phrase with inverted commas. If Google returns a large number of hits, this usually means that the phrase is quite common in academic English. We're using Google Books here, of course, which has a large number of 4% actually of all texts that have ever been published, and a lot of academic texts also. So you type in this phrase, it returns a number of hits, and you then check the author line to make sure that most of the hits are from native speaker texts. Well, the example I've given here is a little more complex. It's a translation example. Where I was trying to find an equivalent of the German phrase, or the German compound noun Faktorenkomplexation, which is often used in education, in pedagogy. Obviously, you can't use complexity here, nor can you use complexion, which is the color of your skin in English, and so on. So I thought it must be something starting with the adjective complex, followed by a noun, and I couldn't think of the right kind of noun at the time. So what you can do in these cases is use a wildcard, use an asterisk, or a star in other words, to substitute for the word that you're looking for, and then you add all factors, and this gives you collocations like a complex interplay of factors, or a complex mix of factors, and so on. An even more systematic way of looking at how language is actually used is to search a corpus, a large electronic collection of specific texts, and texts where you can be absolutely sure that they come from native speaker sources. Now, one general search engine you can use for this purpose is called Skell. Just type Skell into Google and you'll find it quite easily. And what I've done here is I've used the word factor again, and you can see that this returns results that are similar to those of a collocations dictionary, but perhaps a little more exhaustive. So you find a little more comprehensive, such as factor as subject, influence, contribute, affect, determine, drive. There may be quite a few verbs here that didn't crop up in the in the Oxford Collocations dictionary entry. If you want to go beyond that, you can use the Sketch Engine, which should be available at your university library because it's available for free under the European program Horizon 2020. If you want to create a personal account, which also means you can create your own corpora, you have to pay around €60 a year for that. So that's quite a small fee. What you get in Sketch Engine is, for instance, open access journals as a corpus. So you can look at how factor is actually used in a large collection of texts. Type in factor and you will find factor at the center of a number of lines, as you can see here, which makes it easy to locate typical contexts in which factor is used. A more traditional tool you can use, which is also available on the web, of course, these days, is the Monolingual Learners Dictionary. You may remember, for instance, from your school days, the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary, which in those days probably was still in a printed book that you used, and now, of course, this is also available in electronic form. The basic material is available for free, but of course there are also premium versions available. Usually your university library will subscribe to these, and as you can see, you get simple example sentences, you get explanations, definitions of the words, you get collocations, you get phrasal verbs that are associated with the noun factor, for instance, you get examples, you get synonyms, and so on. So these are very useful, especially for non-native speakers of the language. Finally, it may be a good idea to look at parallel texts sometimes, especially if you've got a German phrase in your mind and you can't seem to find a suitable translation solution. What I wouldn't use here is Lingui.de, which is the most common platform used by most learners, but it's not the most reliable one. What is more reliable is Reverso Context, which you can see here, because this is based on reliable corpora and corpora where the translations have been checked by native speakers, which is not the case with Lingui.